So when you're looking at this whole sort of images of Hawaii that drive tourism in the 20th century, they're generated by outside sources. They're generated by Hollywood. Prior to that, they're generated by basically the East Coast literary business, and so they're not ever based here. And some of the paradoxes you get, and this makes it significantly different than is another place. If you look at some place like Paris, or even Rome or someplace, the stereotypes of the place are in part grounded in the place. And so there's a lot of Paris that's stereotyped, but there's almost invariably a significant part of it that's actually based in the reality of Paris as an urban, hub for the last 500 years. In the case of Hawaii, that's not the case. What you have is the stereotypes were generated prior to travel here in large part by significant folks. And so the stereotypes were already there. And so when people came here, they wanted those stereotypes fulfilled, and they had the power and the motivation and the means to make it happen. So when you look at Waikiki, Waikiki is basically a construct of the United States / European tourism industry. It just is based physically here in Hawaii. And that's why, the beach of Waikiki. Well, the beach of Waikiki is actually a mud flat. The beach is actually imported sand originally from Kailua side of this island, later from Molokai, and now it's dug up from right outside of Wailuku and Maui. And in fact, they dig up a Hawaiian Chinese cemetery every time they put in, sand in Waikiki, which is one reason why the sand disappears. There's, geologically and physically, there's no reason for sand to be in Waikiki. And so what you do is you construct a fake beach because the expectations are such that if you're in Hawaii, it has to be a sand beach and it has to be there with the palm trees. So you plant more palm trees. You get rid of the Hawaiian palm trees because they're not attractive enough, and you replant them with Samoan palm trees, which have more fronds. And so you again replace what you've got, because what you have isn't of interest. It's what people's expectations are that has to be fulfilled. And a good example would be this. Here's the Moana Hotel. Good example of classic Waikiki construction. One of the early ones. And again, when you look at it, it's on one hand actually a giant version of the Campbell Estate, which was just down the beach. But also, it's also intended to be an enormous mansion. So if you notice, it doesn't have functionality as a hotel as much as it sort of implies, with the pillars and everything else. It implies a level of sophistication, cost, etc., which again is important because the audience is middle class. And so the folks that are going to stay at the Moana are folks that don't live in houses like this normally, but they want for a short period of time to aspirationally be wealthy, to pretend they live in mansions in California or Seattle, since it was largely a West Coast audience that they were tapping. And that was the Waikiki. Waikiki was based on the middle class desire to emulate their, quote, social betters, which in the case of the West Coast would be pretty much Hollywood and your moneyed elites in places like Seattle and San Francisco. And so this looks like the wealthy mansions that you're going to find on the West Coast, except this is a hotel. It's a place where you pay for a period of time to stay there, and they've got staff that make you feel special because for that period of time, you are special because you paid to be treated to be special. And this is tourism at its finest. You want to make sure that you've got the visual imagery that the population expects. And these visual imageries, ironically, were largely driven by Hollywood. So when you look at this landscape, which I think is the Grand Wailea in Maui, what you're actually looking at is a Hollywood movie set from the 1930s and 40s. And so what you've got is almost every piece of vegetation here is imported. Here's one Hawaiian palm tree, but most of the palm trees here are, again, Samoan palms. Here's date palms. The bougainvillea, which is from the South Pacific. All the rest of this vegetation, torch ginger and stuff like that, is actually from Southeast Asia or the Americas. But what you do is this is the expectation of Hawaii based on the visual imagery generated by other places, supposedly labeled as Hawaii. So when people come here, even today, their expectations for what the Hawaiian landscape looked like is going to be based on these stereotypes that now existed for almost a century and a half. And that's what you have to deliver if you're going to be successful in the tourism business in Hawaii. Again, as I mentioned in the last podcast, The other thing that you have, and this again makes Hawaii unique, most locations don't market their culture. To a certain extent, French culture is marketed when you go to Paris, but Parisians are notoriously supposed to be rude. I don't think they are, but that's the stereotype. New Yorkers are notoriously supposed to be rude. And so in most places, you don't actually market the social behavior value system of the folks there. It's the location or something about it that's supposed to be attractive. In Hawaii, by contrast, the folks that are labeled as Hawaiians to the tourism industry are an enormous part of what is seen as the stereotype of Hawaii. And so Hawaiians are absolutely central to the tourism stereotype of Waikiki and the Hawaiian tourism industry in general, something the tourism industry has always been at great lengths to sort of avoid actually talking about. But tourism would end here in a minute if Hawaiians somehow, were able to just sort of walk from tourism, because tourism here is not based on location. Tourism here is based on a whole ethos of stereotypes, and a lot of those stereotypes are people's behaviors. We're seen as Hawaiian values of aloha, et cetera, et cetera. And here you see a classic Tim, Reese, whatever Reese's name is, one of these images that they sell by the tons in Waikiki of the quote Hawaiian unquote. And again, has very little to, granted, the lady is sort of in a kahiko hula outfit, sort of. But there's nothing about what you see here that has anything to do with hula as a representational art ritual form. This is purely Western style art for a Western style audience that has a stereotype of Hawaiians. And this is intended as a way to sort of consume and tap on that and then make money from it. So unlike most places, the people here, but specifically what's stereotyped by the mainland /Europe/Asia as Hawaiian culture, is stereotyped here. Notice you don't see locals dressed up in these outfits. You're not, the majority population here, which is not Hawaiian, is not part of the tourism industry. They are actually, of course, the people in the tourism business, but they're not marketed in the tourism business. The tourism business is specifically marketing folks that are quote labeled as Hawaiian, unquote. And this makes us sort of unique. But again, it doesn't have anything to do with the people who are actually here. It doesn't have anything to do with Hawaiian culture. It has to do with the mainland, specifically American stereotypes of Hawaiians, of their stereotypes of Hawaiian values and Hawaiian sense. So again, the Reese picture here has absolutely nothing to do with Hawaii. It has to do with the mainland stereotypes that this picture is designed to capitalize on and consume. So now you notice you see this classically here. Here's an old ad from one of those, week in Honolulu or week in Oahu things. But what you see here is the classic set of sort of packaged images for the mainland. This is Hawaii. You've got the idea that you're an escape. Again, this idea of the 3 to 7 day vacation away from the normal life that you live. So the family can do family stuff together. The idea that you have flowers everywhere, that you have grass everywhere, that you have beach everywhere, that you have the ocean behind it everywhere. You've got friendly, quote, Hawaiians, unquote, there. You've got all sorts of things to do that are exotic and different, but they're not creepy exotic. They're not like wrestling alligators or something like that. It's all very low key, sort of mellow, different, exotic. And this becomes the package of Hawaii. And this is still the package. I'm sure if you went to the brochures right now that Hawaii HTA is packaging, you'll find a set of images. They're updated, but it's the same images in terms of the theme and everything attached to them that you see today. Now, as media changes in the 20th, 21st century, these change along with it. So what you find is by the 1930s, 1940s, as radio becomes a significant part of media consumption, Hawaii very quickly jumps on that. And in fact, one of the most popular radio shows in the world in the 1930s and 40s was Hawaii Calls. Weekly broadcast, what is it, what I've got here, 750 stations worldwide. And specifically markets this is oftentimes called Hapa music, which was largely written in LA. And performed by groups. Sometimes the bands were from here, but in many cases they'd actually have 1 or 2 folks from here and make it sound like it's a Hawaii-based band, when in reality it was actually a band out of stage musicians from LA or something like that. Reinterpreted concepts of hula come up with the awana, what's now called the contemporary or modern hula, is all part of this. The use of the lei, which was very, very rarely used traditionally, and traditional materials for lei are almost never seen today. So all this type of stuff that we think of as now as sort of like Hawaiian is again generated largely by the West Coast, largely by media based originally in LA. Later Seattle and San Francisco as it moves to more, radio broadcast also. But then, of course, you justify it by having it based here in Hawaii, specifically Waikiki. By the 1950s, they get the state, the territory, and then later the state to actually subsidize all this. If you go back and you do a Google search for the Kodak hula show that your parents or grandparents might remember, down in Waikiki, was intentionally designed to, sponsored originally by Kodak for selling film to tourists. And again, it was something that was televised frequently, and they would have, groups there. And a lot of the even kumu hulas that you saw in the 1780s that started up originally got their start in performance of the things like the Kodak hula show in this type of music. Don Ho is probably one of the most famous of these. Kimo Kahalana is another one. So, almost everyone who was somebody was originally tied to this. Duke Kahanamoku back in the 30s was, of course, a huge part of this whole sort of popularization of this ethos. And so what you get is by the 1980s, 1990s, the stereotypes of Hawaii are basically fixed. They're done. There's not much you're going to do to modify them. No one wants to mess with them because they work. And what happens then is there's just changes in the format that tourism takes. With jumbo jets, with jets arriving in the 60s, but especially by the 70s, what you get is now Hawaii becomes consumable to a much larger percentage of the American audience, to a lesser extent also European, but largely American, Canadian. And so what you get is bulk tourism, and that's when you see folks like Kaiser building the Hilton Hawaiian Village. You get all the development of Waikiki hotels. You get all the shows that they used to have. All this type of stuff was, most famously here would be Robert's buses, but also Hilo Hattie's. You get these, bulk destinations and bulk masses of tourists coming in, consuming Waikiki for a short period of time, maybe flying over to the Big Island, which is why Hilo has the other international airport, because then you land in Hilo, take the bus up to the volcano, see a volcano eruption, come down, get back on the bus, and largely come back to Waikiki. And so in that concept, what you get is Waikiki specifically is basically built off of soundstage models from Waikiki, of Hollywood. And that makes for a very strange situation if, for example, you're involved in interior design in the resort industry here, because you have a set of very strange constraints as to what is a legitimate Hawaiian, built environment in terms of what the expectations are, because the tourists don't really have very clear concepts of what it is, but they know what it isn't. And so as this starts to change, by the 1980s, bulk tourism has started to shift. People have basically become jaded on the Waikiki, Robert's bus model. The shows all closed down. And what happens is we move to enclave tourism, which would be Kaanapali, Wailea Makena, Waikoloa, Princeville, Pueblo, and the list goes on and on. What these offered is a much more controlled experience, if you would, sort of, based on a more Disneyland model. So whereas Waikiki was just seen as sort of chaotic anarchy, what you got here was a much more controlled image and a much more controlled presentation. So one company or one, collection of companies would control the golf course, would control a little shopping center like the one they have at Wailea, would control the hotels and the entertainments and the things that people could do. And so in this way, they could actually make it very careful attempts to keep much closer to the stereotypes that tourists had. And also, as those stereotypes start to morph and change a little bit, you just change what you offer, to basically adapt yourself to these changing expectations. And what happens as part of this then is as people become more upwardly mobile economically, and as Hawaii does such a good job, especially the outer islands, in fulfilling the stereotype that people already had, is people want to experience for extended periods of time. And so you get the timeshare industry in the 70s and 90s. And of course, after the 90s, what you get is the change of environment, tourism here is the idea of gentrified agricultural homes, which we now consider vacation homes, which are such a huge problem in all the islands. where you get this idea of people purchasing property here and building homes that they live in for very short periods of time of the year as second or third homes. But this allows them to basically avoid the whole sort of tourism package, whether it be Waikiki or the tourism enclave of the 70s and 90s. They got their own place. If you get involved in interior design here and you're doing stuff, you're going to get involved in folks like that. They're one of the major consumers of interior designers here in Hawaii. And again, it's very paradoxical because what you have is these folks are still operating off of stereotypes. But if you think about it, while we have an enormously clear stereotype of Waikiki and what Hawaii is to the tourist presentation, it's very vague when you actually think of what the interior built environment is of a tourist destination. 60s, 70s, and 80s, it would be rattan, flowered prints, et cetera, that falls out of favor. My perception is today it's not really very clear what that is. There's a whole set of just sort of different themes that people are working off of, most of which will seem to attract a lot of sort of compelling arguments to sort of come up with a new common ground, which I suppose on one hand makes it good ground for interior designers that are sort of creative, but it also puts you at high risk of doing something that your clients don't like. And so you end up is basically here what happens is tourism changes. And the huge change that occurs here, so we find it here, that occurs here as with everywhere else globally, is that basically in the 1990s, there's sort of a sea change in the perception of tourism. And this is from the consumer, i.e. the tourist. What the consumer starts to want is the consumer starts to want authenticity. The consumer coming to Hawaii or Paris or any place like that wants to get an authentic experience of that place. Now, mind you, it's not authentic in terms of the reality of it. It's authentic in terms of fulfilling the stereotypes in a more specialized manner. So the stereotypes haven't changed. It's just you get this weird sort of concept of authenticity of stereotypes, which you think about as a contradiction from the get-go. And this makes the whole sort of complex of tourism that you see in the 21st century incredibly bizarre, because when you look at Airbnb and stuff like this, again, this idea of authenticity, that if you're living in a neighborhood with local folks, it's a more authentic Hawaii experience than it would be if you're off, somewhere. And a whole set of impacts, which aren't really part of this class, and dealing, with just the complex groups that you now have. If someone pays, $6 million for a condo at whatever that condo is at Ala Moana Center, they're technically a resident. They dropped in millions of dollars, which is God knows more than I've got, into a place, and so they're investors. They're residents here, but they're not local per se, and they don't live there. They might only live there. Usually, I think most of the folks at that particular development live there for about 3 months a year. They have at least 2 other residences somewhere else in the world, usually in the mainland U.S. Their Korean, Chinese, Japanese counterparts are exactly the same. They're part-time residents. And yet their perception of Hawaii is they're not tourists. Their perception is they've actually bought property here. They actually live here. And so their perception of what they're going to want in their residence, what their expectations are for landscaping and such like that, are going to be pretty radically different from someone who basically is, just renting a place at the EID-GE for 3 nights. And so when you're looking at tourism here, tourism drives an enormous part of what you would call the interior design industry here in Hawaii. Either directly because you're actually working for clients who are part of that whole sort of process, or it's folks that are part of the local population, but in many ways the local population also buys into the tourism images. For the vast majority of the population here, Waikiki's a beach. For the vast majority of the population, they might not like Waikiki, but they see tourism and aspects of tourism to be central to their identity. The relationship that folks have with Hawaiian culture versus the other cultures here is in part with the fact that, of course, Hawaiians are your indigenous population, but it also is with the fact that basically Hawaiian stereotypes, pave the road for the tourism industry, not Japanese or Chinese or Filipino stereotypes. And so to a certain extent, there's this very strange situation where much of Hawaii, and especially Waikiki, especially Oahu, is built on tourism stereotypes, but the tourism stereotypes aren't consumed just by tourists. They're now part and parcel of who we are. They've actually become part and parcel of our identity. And that's not unique. You see this in most locations, especially places that are famous for sort of physicality and resorts, say ski places like Aspen or places like Paris. And so what you find is tourism has impacts way outside of just the number of people that arrive every day and what they consume. It defines our landscaping, it defines how we function, it defines what you can purchase in a furniture store, it defines even the type of foods you can have. And so tourism is absolutely central to who we are. And tourism symbolism is pervasive completely across the spectrum of folks here in Hawaii and the experience of life here in Hawaii.